Welcome, folks, to The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr. Every week, diving deep into the truth of Catholic social teaching and restoring all things in Christ.
The Uncommon Good is on the air. I'm Bo Bonner.
I'm Dr. Bud Marr.
We are coming to you from these United States of America, here in the middle of the country, in the middle of Iowa, in the middle of Des Moines. I'm going to call it the middle of Des Moines, Bud. And it is wonderful to be here. This is The Uncommon Good. Great to be with everyone who is listening, whether that be via the airwaves, distributed by the magical power of radio, or if you're listening live on iowacatholicradio.com or the Iowa Catholic Radio app, and then, of course, all of our wonderful podcast listeners. We are so glad to have you with us. My name, of course, is Bo Bonner, Senior Advisor for Mission Initiatives and Director for the Center for Human Flourishing here at Mercy College. Bud, what do you do at the old ball game?
I'm an academic dean at Mercy College, and I feel low in this chair. Did you set up the chairs where yours would be higher so that you could intimidate me?
Yes. No. Yeah. It's just the subtle power plays when it comes to radio. I don't think anybody realizes that. Do you need a moment to lift the chair up?
No, I've been trying. I can't. I think the knob is broken. I'm at the height of my powers. We better just go on.
Would you rather stand
Carry
up?
on. I might have to. Yeah.
This is some authentic radio that people are hearing.
Yeah, we should have figured out the chair situation before the show started, but no, I just felt low as we started to talk, and I'm thinking to myself, this could be when I have meetings in my office.
You're just going to stand in front of me?
I'll make the chair really low.
I love the subtle digs at the psychology of it all. I'm pretty impressed.
No, I'm dean of liberal arts and sciences at Mercy College of Health Sciences, and it's a good time. Some sweltering weather this week, but students are still learning within our halls. We've got all sorts of programs going on right now, and some community time this past week with that the annual summer picnic.
Yeah, what did they call it this year? The grill and chill.
The grill and chill.
Now that was because there was ice cream involved, but I thought they were trying to make it sound more hip than any of us could actually pull off.
Well, it was a good week to have a grill and chill, but we were eating outside, and it wasn't very chill. I mean, the vibe was chill. The weather was warm. The hamburgers were tasty. I give the hamburgers 3.5 stars out of 5. Oh,
wow. The dogs, for whatever reason, really struck me as wonderful. And then we have some people who are devotees, I think is the right word, of DQ. And so we had the peanut butter. No, what is it? The Buster bars. We had.
No, there were dilly bars.
There were, but there was also, I think, Buster bars.
Oh, I didn't know that. I had an ice cream sandwich, and now I'm regretting my decision.
Well, the point being is, it was warm for Iowa. I have to. I feel bad talking about how warm it is because this last week, all sorts of people in Tulsa, man, didn't have power. So that was weird. But it wasn't a big news event. It was crazy. But my mom and dad actually had to have someone go bring them gas because there was such a run on gas because of generators.
Oh.
At any rate, we're really far afield. What we want to say is Mercy College underwrites the show. That's what we're getting at. And we want to thank them very much for doing so. mchs.edu. And as Bud said, it is warm. It is summer, but we still have students with the sweat of their brow diving into the studies requisite to extend that healing ministry of the Sisters of Mercy. We want to thank them for doing so. Thank you for everyone who supports Mercy College, but thank Mercy College for supporting this show, mchs.edu.
Yeah, I know. I'm a fan of breaks. We all need breaks. We've done shows here on The Uncommon Good about the Sabbath rest and things like that, but there's a part of me that kind of appreciates the year-round structure of the school because the world just feels empty without students.
It's true. It's nice to have them around even. And, they do get breaks. We don't want to make it sound like it's all the way straight through, but it certainly is a way in which you can get into the workforce faster. Speaking of, break or faster, actually neither. This was a bad transition, Bud, but what we're talking about is that we're doing one more radio reading roundup. Not just one more. This is just the next one. We're doing that over Augustine's Confessions. We're going to try to pick up the pace. That's what I was getting at with fast. Is we're going to try to do books 3 and 4. We'll see if we can do it. So much in here, but I think actually 2 books that people kind of skip over. But the basis of a lot of the really important stuff that comes up next. It's been wonderful. I've actually heard some feedback, not tons, but some, about people happy that we're doing the book, the radio reading roundup. So we're happy to have you with us. This is the Uncommon Good. Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr. We'll be back talking about Augustine's Confessions, books 3 and 4, right after this. Back with the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner, Dr. Bud Marr, joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. All the ways available that it is. That was a poetic way of putting it, I suppose. Whether that is through the radio waves, online at iowacatholicradio.com, and at the Iowa Catholic Radio app, all those ways to listen live. And then, of course, those who listen to podcasts, thank you for being our listeners. It's wonderful to be with you. So, continuing our radio reading roundup. This one on Augustine's Confession. We have been, I think, Bud, I would say, appropriately attending very well to the particularities of this book. So, we're not giving you like a 1 or 2 episode summary. We are just really trying to use the books as occasions to get at, I think, theologically great points, things that are worth dwelling on, but of course, issues and realities that have been close to the heart of the show. For instance, fruit stealing, something very... No, but actually, did you notice this, that like when I made this point about like I knew people who stole from Walmart just for the fun of it,
yeah.
and, that like was now, it was a news story, and it was a nationwide news story. Walmart is trying to crack down on it. So I think maybe that was us. I doubt it.
Be careful what sort of things you're speaking into reality.
That's right. But so books 3 and 4, we've got through the introduction, the masterful introduction. We get into him talking about, his life as an infant and then his life as a boy. Here we get into what, I would say is college life, essentially.
Yeah.
He goes to Carthage. He's 19. He spends I have to admit, the beginning of book 3 is a lot like what happened with book 2. He's a sinner. He loves sensuality. He's had some wretched affairs with some women. He does settle down at this point. This is where he first meets the unnamed woman that becomes his mistress for, I think, 15 years? Sounds right? But
sure.
But what we get here is, yes, some things that really start to change in his life. Yeah. Not only important things about, like, he ends up a Manichaean. We can talk about what that means. But the first big, I don't know if it's roadblock, but sort of revelatory moment for him is he reads a book by Cicero called the Horentius, which he says is the best book ever written on philosophy, and it changed his life. And Bud, just a first side comment, that book is lost to us.
Ooh.
Yeah, so like we can't read Cicero's Horentius. We can read excerpts that other people have quoted, but isn't it just fascinating that a book that changed Augustine's life and sort of set his course on eventually becoming the powerhouse juggernaut of the West that he was, is lost to us. We have all sorts of stuff by Cicero, but don't have this book.
That's a bummer, but...
That's the best understatement.
Yeah.
Bummer.
I'm curious.
I love that. Sorry. That's great.
No, but he is at this point. This is where you mentioned the temptations of sensuality. Certainly a part of what keeps Augustine from the church for a time. But he also talks a lot in book 3 about being filled with pride. And he really was just like a prodigy student. And he says he was like ranked first in his class for rhetoric. And for a time, that really held him back. I think we mentioned it on the show last week, but when he first encounters Scripture, he's not very impressed. And it's like with with Scripture, you've got all sorts of books that have been brought together into one collection. And scholars, even, faith-filled scholars have pointed out, if you judge the books of the Bible simply on their rhetorical polish, it's varied. So, like the Gospels, especially I think like John is in very simple Koine Greek. Now, St. Paul was a great rhetorician. The book of Hebrews, I think, impresses scholars from across the spectrum or whatnot. But when Augustine first encounters this, he thinks like, really, like this can't be the vehicle for revelation. Now, later, he begins to see like reasons why God would actually design the Bible in that manner, or like providence would lead the Bible to its final form, because he sees pride as an obstacle along his way. But as I understand it, it's really with Cicero that he feels like his mind, it doesn't automatically trigger a conversion, but it draws his mind upwards into transcendent things. So this is where he first develops his love for philosophy. Philosophy, of course, like with a lot of different fields of study, we say biology, zoology, it's like the study of something. Philosophy is the love of wisdom. And so this is sort of the beginning of Augustine's spiritual journey, which ends in his desire for God.
Yeah, there's a lot to bring up. So he does say, in Greek, the love of wisdom is called philosophy, and it was with this love that the book inflamed me. And indeed, he says, the Horentius quite changed my whole attitude and turned my prayers towards thee, O Lord. What is interesting to me is, so he goes, look, I was 19, and this changed everything. I stopped being the big turkey that I was. Not, and I guess we didn't say this part. Not only did he have the sensuality problem, but he loved hanging out with a gang essentially called the Wreckers, which, by the way, really cool name. And everyone else in my mind is running around in a toga, but these guys have leather jackets and greaseback hair. I've read too much of The Outsiders. But my favorite thing that Augustine points out is I liked hanging around the Wreckers, but I was too much of a nerd to realize that I didn't need to ruin my job prospects. So I never formally joined, but we were like buddies. So imagine 18, 19-year-old Augustine already having plenty of affairs and then people point out this really does sound like the 60s. So he is running around believing in this sort of whatever's new and cool and hip. The Manichaeans, which we'll talk about, only reached North Africa sort of in his time there. It was maybe a few years before that. He's hanging out with a cool group that loves, being revolutionaries. He's sleeping with women. And then he reads. So, and it's funny, too, but because he's really been worried about his studies. He sort of bashes rhetoric. But it's his rhetorical studies that make him read the Horentius, because people want him to read that because Cicero is considered this master rhetorician. And it's here that he stops. And it's interesting because, let me back up, sometimes people get this idea, they hear Cicero, they hear any of the Greeks or Romans, bud, and they have this idea that they're like, oh yeah, well these are they're all smart fuddy-duddies from the past. Cicero technically is a skeptic. So people miss this point. He actually is a sort of academic skeptic, a purist, gets into these big sort of dorky historical things no one cares about but me, like philosophers. But what Cicero does is he goes, I have a lot of doubts, I have a lot of skepticism about how the world is, but what I know is that when you have to choose something and pour your life into it. And this is this pursuit. So unlike everyone else who's sort of just I'm going to do rhetoric because it can get me a good job, or I'm going to be a wrecker, or I'm just going to go after pleasures, Cicero, though mired with great doubts, says, even in my skepticism, I realize that what I'm after is the good life and wisdom, and I'm going to commit to these things. And so he writes ethics and even metaphysics and politics with this in mind. Though I have questions, it's important to give up on just material pleasures in order to go after what must be true and beautiful. And this changes his life. He says he's never the same after this. And what I find this interesting too, though, bud, the only thing that he said checked his love of Cicero is that he doesn't mention Jesus, which is interesting because at this point it makes it sound like, I think sometimes we think Augustine is just like this hoodlum that hates the faith. But he says, I've been nursed on that name, Jesus, like mother's milk. And so even though I wasn't following it, the only thing that ever held me back is when someone didn't mention Jesus. Yeah. I find that an interesting detail that he just sort of throws in there.
Well, and this is the same time period where he's also seduced by the Manichaeans, so this alternate philosophical system. And I don't know, maybe you could tease this out for me, Bo, but it seems like what really flummoxes him and sort of stalls him on the path to God is that as he looks out at the world, he sees so much evil. And so the idea of an all-powerful God who created everything and is love itself seems impossible to him. And the Manichaeans, simplistically stated, they saw the universe more as it's the expression or the manifestation of two competing powers. And so there's a good force and an evil force, and they're locked in this cosmic battle. And Augustine points out, at this point in his life, he doesn't understand that, evil is a privation of the good, that it's more like a rip in the fabric of the universe. It's to conceive of it as a material substance or even something that has existed all along, alongside the good, was to misconceive it. But he's stuck in those ways. And he says, like, there's questions that the Manichaeans ask him that just, like, bog him down. Like, because he doesn't have the idea of God as spirit, like, they're saying, like, does God clip his fingernails? And for Augustine, he's, like, unable to really, like, so I mean, it's almost like the theistic worldview at that point to him just seemed foolish. It didn't seem possible.
Well, I mean, not theist, spiritual theist, but you're right. So, I mean, he believes that there's these, like, two opposing theisms, as it were, the light and the dark. But you're right. He has a very strange understanding of spirit. Like, he keeps talking about spiritual bodies and keeps admitting how he doesn't know what he's talking about at the time. What's interesting is actually the Manichaeans speaking the name of Jesus is what led him astray. He goes, because Cicero didn't bring up Jesus, I didn't think it could ultimately be true. But here comes the Manichaeans saying things and, like, claiming that they're from Scripture. And so, like, that sort of just appeal to his childhood religion of his mom makes him go, oh, I should go do this. So it's interesting that because they actually talk about the Lord, but incorrectly, it was more of a trap than straight up pagan Cicero, who never mentions it is, which is interesting because, he really does, like, poo-poo on liberal arts and like the vanity that it causes him. But he straight up says, like, look, all of the pagan poetry is much better than the Manichaeans, because the pagan poetry, everybody knew Medea didn't do the things that the poem says, but I believed this horrible stuff. He says that the Manichaeans were trying to feed him with food like you experience in a dream, which is interesting. He goes, the food you eat in real life and the food you eat in a dream are similar, but one gives you nutrition and the other doesn't. And that's what the Manichaeans are doing. So it's interesting that because they mention Jesus, they draw him astray. But then to your point, he makes this, he says this again and again, how it is that the empty food they were feeding him were exactly these sort of doubts, right, about what it means to actually believe about goodness, right, or evil itself. And so one of the sidetracks he gets to do, I didn't know if you noticed this, but evidently the Manichaeans are trying to say, like, oh, so what about the patriarchs and the fact that, for instance, they married more than one wife, or that, Jacob did some shady stuff. And Augustine goes into this very long digression about how there are some moral truths that never change, but then there's also moral truths that God has demanded of people throughout time that were appropriate to their time and place because people were not ready for it, which is interesting because some people call this progressive revelation and act like only modern people have done it. But Augustine is straight up saying God asked certain things. Now, there's some things that never change, but God asked certain things of certain people because at the time that's the best they could do, or it was only appropriate to them. And so he likens it to this, but he goes, when the Manichaeans accuse the Old Testament of being morally faulty because they ask specific things of people that are no longer asked, and the easiest one to, like, not wade into some of the other issues would be animal sacrifice. Why are they sacrificing animals but we're not? And the Manichaeans say this is proof that the Old Testament was from an inferior material God. Augustine says this would be like someone who was handed armor, puts it on incorrectly, and says it doesn't work. That every part of the armor belongs in a certain place, and there's a certain order you have to put it on, or the armor itself makes no sense. And so he goes, when people attack the order of progressive revelation that God has given to people, it is like being given armor that only belongs in a certain place and time, putting it on out of order, and then complaining that the armor doesn't work. I've read the Confessions multiple times, but I only noticed it this time, and I think that's a very provocative point.
Well, yeah, Augustine really is a very sophisticated theologian. I say that, I mean, sort of like with a little bit of credulity in my voice, because there's a way in which, like, you read the Confessions, and it doesn't seem to have the same speculative depth as, like, St. Thomas Aquinas' Summa, Like, we don't think of it in those terms, but going back through the Confessions, I can see why St. Augustine became sort of like the foundation of Western theology, because he's for me, it's kind of refreshing. Like, he's really puzzling over these deep theological questions, but he's doing it sort of like in an engaging biographical manner. So, I was really struck by, again, he's kind of like bringing to the surface all of his philosophical struggles. And he asked this question, and I'm guessing it was kind of like a counterfactual posed to him by the Manichaeans. I don't think I'm using counterfactual there correctly, but like a challenge that was posed by them where they said, well, like, if there is this truly all-powerful, all-loving God, like, do the sins that we commit, do those hurt God? And, like, when Thomas Aquinas comes along, he makes the point, like, God is pure act. Mm-hmm. God is not part of the furniture of the universe. It's not like there's potency in God, and then he brings that to action. He's pure act. He is the one in whom we live and move and have our being. And so Augustine says, like, our sins, like the crimes that we commit, they don't, properly speaking, harm God in any way, but he's designed and ordered the universe in such a way that when we sin, it corrupts and it harms our own nature. And so there's kind of like this retributive order to human action where insofar as we sin, it's not like we're somehow like bringing God down. Right. We're moving further away from God. And it's only by like turning back to him, or in Augustine's case, or all of our cases, he says like through the tug of grace that God brings us back to true happiness.
No, that's interesting because it's parallel. Like you said, he does such a good job of paralleling these deep philosophical arguments with historical details that themselves are very interesting. So he, oh, excuse me. When he's making that big deal that I was pointing out about, the Manichaeans. Give me 1 second, sorry. The Manichaeans are doing their magic.
I feel like playing some sort of like, that music that you hear when you're waiting on the telephone. And
yeah, so, sorry. When the Manichaeans, he said, are feeding him false food, he makes this point that they'll even talk about, not only will they say the name of Jesus and not actually be speaking about it truly, they'll even talk about like heavenly bodies, and they'll say the sun represents things. And he said it would have actually been better to basically worship the sun than these falsehoods. And he makes this point. He goes, the images of all those bodies which actually exist are far more certain than these fantasies of the Manichaeans. The bodies themselves are more certain than the images, yet even these thou art not. He's speaking to God. Thou art not even the soul, which is the life of bodies, and clearly the life of the body is better than the body itself, but thou art the life of souls, the life of lives, having life in thyself and never changing. O life of my soul. So, but we get back to this, right, that he's making this point that as much as he said any of these things sub-God can lead you astray because out of the vanity, that we were talking, you brought up earlier, it can make you become self-inclusive, right? It's like a stream that's blocked off and that becomes stagnant because it's only immersed in itself. But he's pointing out that there's actually things, though, that are far worse at dragging people away because they take the higher things but fake people out. Whereas even the pagans, as wrong as they were, I mean, he's admitting this, right? Like he's worried about the liberal arts, but it's Cicero that starts him down the right path. And it's these people mentioning Jesus that bring him down the wrong one. So this gets into what is often, far too often, truncated and like, see, Augustine is a Neoplatonist, which means that he thinks there's like these absolute truths and everything else is sort of like an iteration or just a mere image. But he's actually saying the opposite, that if you take the time to really follow the chain up, you'll get to God. It's when you sort of stop yourself short, like you were saying, that we'll miss out. This is going to be really important in Book 4 when we talk about this in the next segment, because this is his profound and actually really heartfelt rumination on friendship, I think, is where he's going to talk about this as the difference that, all things, like you're hinting at with evil, all things are potentially good. Evil is a lack that comes, like that armor metaphor, where you misarrange things and put them in the wrong order. That if we could order things rightly, we could, in all of these traveling metaphors, we could get to where, not only where we want to be, but a desire that can actually be filled. And so it's interesting here in Book 3, like you said, that there's all these ways that he hints at getting closer, but along the way, every time he's getting closer, there's just one more thing that can set us astray and send us down the wrong path. And I think that like this idea of the food that does not fulfill is the chief metaphor that he's throwing out here at the Manichaeans, and just hoping that at some day, right, that he will arrive at the place that Monica is hoping for him because of his tears, which you brought up last week. So this is the Uncommon Good. We've reached this segment's end. We'll bring up Book 4 when we're back after this. Back with the Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. We are doing our radio reading roundup on Augustine's Confessions, Book 3 and 4. Just got done talking about Book 3. Bud, we'll jump into Book 4. But I think that we're specifically experts about the next part because Augustine speaks about friendship. And if there's anything, Bud, that we deserve a blue ribbon, it's showing how friendship really should be. What do you say, buddy?
Oh, our friendship?
I see what it means to you.
No, I think the Uncommon Good is built around friendship. Hopefully,
not where one of us are dying.
Our friendly banter is a good sign of that. But also, I think we've always had as our primary theme Catholic social teaching. If you think about the just society or the basic building blocks of society, it really is built on true friendship. And like Aristotle says, and Augustine gets into a little bit here, a true friendship, authentic friendship, is a common search for the good. And there's other reasons like human beings form friendships, but they're all imperfect insofar as they don't approximate towards that.
Yeah, and I mean, this book starts off with him admitting that he has a mistress and that he cared for her and that this was a change in his life, right, that he went from just sleeping around to Cicero getting him back on track, even though it has the side stop at the Manichaeans, but that he stays faithful to her and even has a kid with her that they raise together. But he starts to talk about how it's weird that he's into philosophy now, and he's going to try to like turn his life around, but there's all these side stops and stuff that he admits is just stupid. So, for instance, he talks about he gets into astrology, and there's this old man who's like, look, I remember when I got into it because I could make money off of it, but then I got so sick of doing that, and I decided to do the right thing. You can make money off of rhetoric. Why are you doing this? And Augustine looks at himself, and he goes, oh, I realize I'm doing it and all of these things, Lord, when I was doing these things, because I didn't want to admit it was my fault that I was hurting people, hurting my mother, hurting this friend we're going to talk about, but of course hurting himself because he was hurting his relationship with God. So he goes, yeah, I was turning to something I knew in my heart was stupid because I would rather it be like Venus or Mars's fault that I was a sinner rather than take responsibility for it. And here's one emblem or even example of this old man befriending him enough to go, why are you doing this? Calling him out on the carpet. A subtle rhetorical move, Bud, that I think he then moves into. Like, here's a good friend who advised well, this old man to me. But then his friend he talks about when he's dying, and you can hear the lament in his pen that this person had been Catholic and he drug him into the Manichaean faith.
Yeah, so we talk about Augustine's rhetorical skills, or he kind of brags about himself at one point. And Bo, for me, this part of the book, you really get a picture of that because Augustine does a great job of painting this picture of, I think as human beings, like anyone who's self-reflective has gone through this, where you have that recognition that nothing in the world that you cherish, you can ultimately cling to. Mm-hmm. And so it's kind of, his mind is reeling as his young friend starts to face death because he had banked on these friendships as one source of his happiness. And he says, like, this friend was like the other half of his soul. Mm. And then when he sees his friend dying, not only like does he experience like the weight of guilt that comes with, like at one point leading him astray in the faith, but his mind sort of reels at the recognition that he too himself will die. And that, because he truly, like you talked about a proper ordering of goods, he had sort of poured himself into these various pursuits, like perhaps sensuality will bring me happiness, perhaps friendship will bring me happiness, perhaps the love of wisdom, like that will be enough. And he recognizes that they're all fading, that like he can't, like ultimately there'll be these realities that pass through his fingers.
And it's interesting too. What this reminds me of, and we've consistently, I think, noted to people that Augustine really loves Job without ever explicitly saying it. What this reminds me of is the Terrence Malick movie, The Tree of Life, because right after that scene where, of course, like the son dies and the husband and wife are devastated, we get the Jobian in the movie, right? It's like, here's the creation of Earth and dinosaurs and everything like this. But like you said, rhetorically, we get this sense, right? Like just the sheer guilt of this friend dying, and that with his dying words essentially tells Augustine, get away from me. So the story goes like Augustine had this friend that he loved, like it sounds more than anyone else, that he had led him astray into Manichaeism, and that when he was on his deathbed, people baptized him even though when he was out of commission. And so when he wakes up, Augustine's like, hey, can you believe these people did that to you? Ha, ha, ha. What superstition? And the guy's like, get away from me. Like,
Yeah.
They are saving my life. And so he leaves, and then the guy dies. He goes back into a fever coma and dies without him there. And so Augustine realizes, right, that this is this figurative moment of him having to wrestle with himself and stop being so unserious, because he's like, I nearly let my friend die out of the church and was rightly rebuked. It was almost like this miracle that he regained his consciousness to tell Augustine, I don't want to have a part of you if you're going to keep speaking that way. And the rest of the chapter, it just changes pace. It's like, it's like it's written as if you're looking at this great vista of time. And it really is this asking about the nature of friendship, and that he obviously loves friendship, but that it can only take you so far because we all die. And it's just breathtaking. And I think it's sad how often I think chapter 4 gets short shrift.
Yeah, and for me, this is one of the seminal works when it comes to how Christians, I should say, are meant to live in the world. We kind of touched on this last week, but, there are some faith traditions where the ultimate goal is to kind of extinguish desire. Augustine, he really paints this really riveting picture of how the things of this world don't bring him ultimate happiness. And you, as a reader, if like you're reading St. Augustine for the first time, you might expect him to move like, therefore, I chucked it out altogether. But you begin to see how he provides this wonderful reflection on how like the goods of this world are truly good as long as they're properly ordered towards the love of God. So like, for instance, this is sort of the middle part of book 4. Blessed is the one who loves you and loves his friend in you and his enemy for your sake. He alone loses no one dear to him, to whom all are dear, and the one who is never lost. So to love another human being as like an end in itself, ultimately you'll lose that. But if you love them as one who is dear on the side of God, you'll never lose them. Turn us toward yourself, O God of hosts. Show us your face, and we shall be saved. For wheresoever a human soul turns, it can but cling to what brings sorrow, unless it turns to you. Cling though it may to beautiful things outside you and outside itself. So we're sort of like hardwired to know God. If we turn to another good and make that like our ultimate pursuit, it will bring unhappiness. But if we turn towards God, all of a sudden those other things find their proper place.
It's interesting, too. I think a lot of people, when they're translating or talk about it, they use that terminology like, if you make something else other than God for its own sake, you'll lose it. And then people will quickly go, so everything else is only useful for pursuing God.
Yeah.
That goes against, like, for instance, anything John Henry Newman says, or it goes against what I've been on record to say. But I think that what he's getting at is things can only be good in and of themselves insofar as they rest in God. Otherwise, you are cutting them off from the vitality of the thing that makes them what they are and have any chance of actually possessing it in any way. It's sort of like, why would you cut a flower off from its root if you could just leave it in its root to grow? And that's what, all of these things, like you said, are beautiful and good, but to cut them off is to have them wither into your hands. As he says, "O madness that knows not how to love men as they should be loved." And that he made his error his God, right? That there was nothing past these goods. But even like emo Augustine, this is very emo Augustine territory, is beyond awesome. He goes, "Thus I remained to myself an unhappy lodging, where I could neither stay nor leave. For where could my heart fly from my heart? Where could I fly from my own self? Where would I not follow myself?" But this is amazing, because what he's trying to say is that the problem is that he never learned to love his friends for their own sake. He loved his friends because he didn't want to be in himself. He was sick of himself. He didn't like himself. He was ashamed of himself. And so his friends, which he acted like, oh, I'm making them the highest good, he's actually using them, right? He is actually the one that's using them as an instrument. I just wanted to get out of myself. But even there, I carried myself and my self-interest. It is only by loving our friends, like you're saying, in God, sort of taking the spotlight off of them, that we stop loving them instrumentally and can love them for themselves, because the definition of who they are is only in God. They're lovable because God has loved them into existence. It is such an interesting small point, but it's a profound one.
Well, and this is, it's this same chapter where you get a very Newmanian point, because ultimately what turns Augustine back to God is the practice of virtue. And I mentioned St. John Henry Newman because there's all sorts of arguments for God's existence. And, St. Thomas famously put forth his 5 ways. Newman was familiar with all of these. In the 19th century, when he's writing, what really sort of captivated him was the reality of conscience. And he says conscience is sort of like our first stumbling towards God, because it alerts us to the reality not only of a law that's sort of written into the nature of things, but a lawgiver, because when we violate our conscience, we feel as if it's akin to like offending a parent. So when we do good, we feel like relief or at peace, and when we do wrong or evil, we feel shame and we feel unsettled. And Augustine says, as he's being drawn back to the truth, that he begins to love the peace that accompanied virtue and to hate the discord inseparable from a vicious way of life. And so he observed that the former unity was to be found, but in the latter fragmentation. So like there's almost kind of like this natural movement towards God insofar as he's living a virtuous life. He says, I feel at peace, and I feel there's like a coherence or a unity in my existence, where whenever I sinned, it was like my life became more fragmented and characterized by discord.
Yeah, and to that note, he re-brings up in a different way the famous line from the beginning that we can't rest until we find rest in you. So he says, return to your heart, O you transgressors, and hold fast to him who made you. Stand with him, and you shall stand fast. Rest in him, and you shall be at rest. And he loves that sort of paradox, right? So, for instance, he's talking about Jesus. For he left us, and behold, he is here. He could not be with us long, yet he did not leave us. He went back to the place that he had never left, for the world was made by him. So that point you're making, that it can seem paradoxical both ways, right? Like, so the more that we try to get outside of ourselves because we don't like ourselves, we're actually going to use others and actually make it all about us. But the more that we let that go and let other things exist in God, they come back to us as the thing for which they're worthy to be pursued. Just like Jesus had to leave so that he could be with us till the end of the age. And so this gets back to, like you said, that Newmanian point that can seem paradoxical unless we take the step back to see it in the full view.
Yeah, when St. Augustine's certainly a doctor of the church, right?
Oh, yes.
I should have checked the official list beforehand. But with the doctors of the church, you hear different specific terms given to them. So, like, St. Thomas is the angelic doctor, and partly because of his profound ruminations on angels, but I mean, there's also like another connotation that some have said John Henry Newman, if or when he's declared a doctor of the church, will be the doctor of conscience. He's given us some of the most profound reflections on that topic. With St. Augustine, it's hard to decide, like, if you call him the doctor of something, what would it be? I think, you could name him the doctor of grace. And, like, this book, you really begin to see how God's grace worked so wonderfully and beautifully in his life. Without grace, the sins of our youth, or like the paths that we took away from the good, those would be things that we could only regret. And there is a tinge of regret as Augustine talks about his past life. And he knows like there was time that in a certain light you could say time wasted. He spent his time pouring into these created goods that couldn't provide happiness. And so, so much time in rhetoric or in sensuality or with friendships that weren't ordered to the good but towards something else. But God's grace redeems all that. And I'm skipping way ahead. Late in the book, he has this wonderful prayer that I think captures all of this. And you'll find this sometimes in devotional manuals. But when we talk about redemption, we say like when God saves us, he redeems our past sins, he redeems our time. You can really hear this in this wonderful prayer by St. Augustine. Late have I loved you, O beauty, ever ancient, ever new. Late have I loved you. You were within me, but I was outside, and it was there that I searched for you. In my unloveliness, I plunged into the lovely things which you created. You were with me, but I was not with you. Created things kept me from you, yet if they had not been in you, they would have not been at all. You called, you shouted, and you broke through my deafness. You flashed, you shone, and you dispelled my blindness. You breathed your fragrance upon me. I drew in breath, and now I pant for you. I have tasted you, now I hunger and thirst for more. You touched me, and I burn for your peace. So within that prayer, what I hear, Bo, is even the things that led St. Augustine astray, like this relationship with his mistress, his time with the Manichaeans, his friendships, even like being part of a gang. All of those things, in a sense, could be construed as wasted time. But once God had called him into a relationship, they were brought up and redeemed. And even the things that led him astray, you can begin to see like a purpose. And that might be not the most precise term, but like how God called good out of evil and used even like the errors of the Manichaeans to lead him to the truth.
Oh, man. I got one. I got a perfect one. You led that up. Speaking of good friends, man, we are the other half here. You say the doctor of grace. I think in classes past when I've taught this, I threw out that he's the doctor of desire. But the one that I want to focus on, because it can seem counterintuitive, he seems to be against this. I think he's the doctor of language. And it's interesting where this man who was rhetorically brilliant and has so much to worry about speaking brings up speaking to make sense of the hardest things. Precisely, I love how you put this, that everything seems like wasted time except through God's eternity, in which no time is wasted. So he brings this up, but because he has this big question, evil. Well, why do people die? Why don't things just persist forever? So that he starts to bring up an answer, and it has to do with language as the metaphor to speak of it. For lovely things would simply not be unless they were from thee. So he's talking to God. They come to be and they pass away, and by coming they begin to be, and they grow towards perfection. Then when perfect, they begin to wax old and perish. And if all do not wax old, still all perish. This is the way of things. This is where he starts to give this very creative example about why did God allow for there to be temporality at all, bud? Why didn't, when God created anything, it just continue to persist? And so he goes, for example, our speech is accomplished by sounds which signify meanings, but a meaning is not complete unless one word passes away when it has sounded its part, so that the next may follow after it. Very interesting, right? That he's bringing up again. It's sort of this the same metaphor with if we don't put on the armor correctly and attach it to the right part, it won't make sense. Yeah. But it's the segmentation of the armor that makes it. But here's the part where he just explains it. For what we speak, you also hear through physical sensation, yet you would not wish that the syllables should remain. Instead, you wish them to fly past so that others may follow them and the whole be heard. Thus it is always that when any single thing is composed of many parts, which do not coexist simultaneously, the whole gives more delight than the parts could ever do perceived separately. But far better than all this is he who made it all. He is our God, and he does not pass away, for there is nothing to take his place. But, so, existence is symphonic. Yeah. And he goes, God makes temporal things because they play a part in the greater whole. And if they didn't ever stop, there would be, as it were, no speech. I mean, he's talking about speech, but even music, right? If the notes didn't stop playing, there wouldn't be music. But that is a phenomenal way to think through the problems, especially of evil and temporality and difficulty. The very reasons he goes to the Manichaeans, and he keeps bringing this up about speech and how it works. So, again, we've talked about this in terms of allegory, right? That, like, in their mind, God would make things exist in reality so that there could be the allegorical read. Allegorical reads don't, so to speak, solve problems. So now existence itself, but is an allegory. God speaks through the existence of temporal things and speaks an everlasting truth. Phenomenally brilliant, and what a way to, like, put a pin in a declaration about the goods of friendship, that they only last if there's friendships in God, and to deal with the sadness of death and the hope of eternal life. This is The Uncommon Good. We'll be back right after this. Back with The Uncommon Good, Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr joining you this week. Thank you for listening to the show. Bud wrapping up another radio reading roundup. This time we did Augustine's Confessions, books 3 and 4. And, man, just to brag, this was a great idea. I've always loved doing the radio show, but I've been more invigorated talking about this. I'm glad that I'm thinking that you came up with it first. So kudos, speaking of friendship, for coming up with this, because it has been an exciting time to talk about this, and I hope our listeners are enjoying it as well.
Yeah, I'm a bad marketer, but I keep thinking about ways to, like, capitalize on this. Like, can we start publishing, like, uncommon versions of these famous titles? I don't think that will work. Like, by the leather bound 1750th anniversary edition of St. Augustine's Confessions.
I'm like, yeah, what I can imagine how bad, like, the translate, like, we translate it into Bo and Bud speak. I don't know if we want to know. I don't want to hear from the audience what they think that would sound like.
There's like a whole packet. It comes with, like, a bushel of peaches and, like, a hologram sticker of St. Augustine.
Yeah, well,
we better just stick with radio.
I like the idea. Yeah, I mean, we have some marketing friends, so no, I'm kidding.
Speaking of sticking with radio, if you want to pray with us, we do broadcast the Rosary on air, 6 a.m. and 10 a.m. each day. The Chaplet of Divine Mercy is prayed at 2:55 in the afternoon, and you can also download the Iowa Catholic Radio app to pray the Rosary anytime, anywhere.
Absolutely, and if you want to make sure to be a part of what's going on in the Iowa Catholic Radio listening area, especially around Des Moines, but of course at all the places that the radio signal reaches, you can go to iowacatholicradio.com and click on events. Depending on when you're hearing this, this June 24th, this weekend at 1 o'clock, the Iowa State Capitol, at the Iowa State Capitol, the Iowa March for Life with Pulse Life Advocates. Same thing, again, depending on when you're hearing this, June 24th at 6 o'clock in Clive, the Horizon Event Center. Night Fire concerts present Jordan Feliz with special guest spoken. If you're listening on the Sunday broadcast, I hope you were there. I hope it worked out. July 14th in West Des Moines, we have at St. Francis of Assisi another Man Up West Power Lunch. July 15th at the Community Choice Credit Union Convention Center Ballroom. Walker Hayes presented by Fairway to benefit the Iowa Catholic Radio Foundation. July 27th through 29th, we got the 42nd Annual Chesterton Conference with Dale Alquist, Bishop Robert Barron, and Christopher Check. And then, August, speaking of Augustine, August, not that far away, August 10th on the Iowa State Fair, at the Iowa State Fair for King and Country with special guest We the Kingdom. On the 20th, Kane. And then after that, you can go check that other stuff out as well. Also, always remember that this is more, this ministry is not just the people on air, behind the boards or behind the desks. It's your ministry as well. We crave your prayers. We are thankful for your talents when you volunteer them. But really, this works only if you're able to support it with your treasure. We appreciate all the people who donate. It means a lot to us. But if you can keep that going so that we can have the truths espoused by our Lord and Savior Jesus Christ transmitted through the radio waves and on the internet as much as possible. We are truly grateful. You can go to iowacatholicradio.com to donate on the Iowa Catholic Radio app or 515-223-1150 to call or text in order to donate to the show. Well, Bud, you need to stay cool out there.
I'm staying cool. I'm already starting to compile my Iowa State Fair menu. I know it's early, but you need a long runway to prep for the various fried offerings.
That's true. I should have actually said stay chill, right? To stay, any rate. That's a bad joke.
What's the difference between chill and cool?
I don't know, but I'm sure that if we even ask the kids, they'd be like, we use neither of these words. We already sound way older than we're even trying to be. The point being is, stay safe out there, folks. Enjoy your summer. We'll be back next week. This is The Uncommon Good. May Jesus Christ, the Prince of Peace, reign in our hearts, family, city, state, nation, world, solar system, galaxy, the whole kit and caboodle. This is The Uncommon Good. For my friend, Bud Marr, we're out. See you next week.
The Uncommon Good with Bo Bonner and Dr. Bud Marr is heard every week on wonderful Catholic stations like this one and anytime on podcast. Just search for The Uncommon Good.
Support for Iowa Catholic Radio and The Uncommon Good provided by Mercy College of Health Sciences. Learn more at mchs.edu.